Hi, this is Riley.
And I'm Jasmine. And we're presenting the Wooley, Borger, and Markman study, Visit from the Candy Witch, Factors Influencing Young Children's Beliefs in Novel Fantastical Beings. So a little bit of background information. Children form beliefs based on reality. And childhood fantasy beliefs can be defined as beliefs in imaginary beings and entities which cannot be observed by researchers. They often have very inherent contradictions. For example, a human Santa who has flying reindeer and delivers presents. And kids often receive a variety of information from a number of different sources about these entities. So this makes it really difficult to isolate factors that contribute to the beliefs. Researchers think that these entities and ideas are most pervasive between the ages of 3 and 7, with a peak at age 4. And there are lots of different kinds of imaginary entities, but often they're tied to a very specific event in time, like losing a tooth or a holiday. And there is no previous research on fantasy formation in children. Rather, past research has always been done on the existence of these beliefs in kids. So this study sought to answer the question, what factors influence fantasy entity belief formation in children? Specifically, the researchers were concerned with exploring several factors, including the number of fantasy beings children already believe in, their motivation for their beliefs, and the extent to which children's parents joined the researchers in providing evidence for the existence of these beliefs. So this led to their hypotheses of what are the effects of age, existing beliefs, motivation, individual fantasy orientation, and if the child was visited by the entity based on the belief of novel fantasy entity, which the researchers coined the Candy Witch. They also wanted to explore what human and non-human properties children would attribute to the fantasy entity. So in order to answer these questions, 23 preschool age children ages 3 to 4 and 21 older preschool children ages 4 to 5 were tested individually by researchers. So all participants were introduced to a made-up entity titled the Candy Witch through 2 activities at their daycare centers. Following 1 week before Halloween, children were brought to the research center and introduced to the Candy Witch by experimenters. They were asked specific questions about their previous knowledge about Halloween traditions and the Candy Witch, and they were given a story about the Candy Witch, which detailed her coming into the child's house after the parents phoned her and replacing their Halloween candy with a new toy. And then they were also shown an image of a Candy Witch doll. And the purpose of this was just to reaffirm the fantasy existence in the children. And then a day before Halloween, different researchers visited the children's classrooms to make a Candy Witch art projects with the children. So following the initial procedure, parents were given the option for further participation, where they were either able to carry out the fantasy story of the Candy Witch and were given the option to call the Candy Witch and get a toy from the researchers to replace their child's Halloween candy, or to not follow through with the story. And then they were surveyed on their level of encouragement of the witch's existence, their child's belief in the witch, and they were asked for specific examples on how they encouraged the belief in the household. So they measured the belief with the reality status question survey, where children were shown pictures of a witch and asked if she was real or pretend. The questions from the reality status question survey included real and made up entities, including a child, a cat, and the child's teacher, as well as the fantasy entities, including a fairy, a dragon, and a ghost, and fantasy beings, including Santa, the Easter Bunny, and of course the Candy Witch. So this shows ultimately the child's beliefs about other entities to the researchers. Following the RSQ, children were asked to rate on a visual scale how certain they were about their answers for one of the entities in each of the 3 categories. So they were reminded of the judgments that they had previously made about the entities, and they were asked to either point or to vocalize their answers based off of the visual scale shown. So following this, they were given an open-ended interview, asking for descriptions about the Candy Witch and if she had visited their house. And then this was followed by an attribution task in which kids were asked about the human and non-human qualities of the Candy Witch. They were asked about 3 physical, 3 social, 3 psychological, and 3 biological attributions of the entity. So the children were also assessed on their candy versus toy preference, in which they would choose if they could only have one, which relates to their motivation to believe in the Candy Witch. If they really like new toys, then they would be more motivated to believe in the Candy Witch, whereas if they had a preference for candy, they might not be as motivated. And then their fantasy orientation was measured with 5 different scales: the imaginary play predisposition interview, the imaginary companion interview, a free play with blocks task, an impersonation interview, and a toy choice task. So then following this, children were coded on a high, moderate, or low fantasy scale. 23 of the children who participated scored high on their fantasy orientation, and 23 scored low on their fantasy orientation. And for this portion, there was no age effect.
So for the results, the 2 age groups were combined into a single sample because there was no difference in belief level. And when asked to describe the Candy Witch in the open-ended interview, the majority of children, 73%, brought up the candy toy exchange, and others described her appearance. 2 of the children reported nothing, while 10 children described aspects of the Candy Witch that were not part of the experimenters' presentations. Of the children who were visited by the Candy Witch and were asked what she did at their house, the majority, 88%, brought up the candy toy exchange, and 2 out of the 3 children who did not mention the exchange brought up the phone call. Additionally, 88% of the children in this group said that they believed the Candy Witch would visit their house again. On the reality status question, the mean level of belief with a maximum score of 2 was a 1.4, which is comparable to Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, and significantly higher than the mean scores for generic fantasy creatures such as dragons and fairies. And children's RSQ response and their certainty ratings were combined to create a measure of the strength of belief, and scores ranged from 0 for children who were certain that the Candy Witch was pretend, up to 6 for children who were certain the Candy Witch was real, and the mean score for all children was 4.2, which signaled that most of the children genuinely believed that the Candy Witch was real. And overall, older children had higher levels of belief than younger children. And there was a significant interaction between condition and age group, which showed that older children who were visited had higher levels of belief than older children who were not visited. And there was also an effect of fantasy orientation on belief. So children with high fantasy orientation tended to believe in the Candy Witch more than those with low fantasy orientation. However, this was only a trend amongst children who were not visited, and FO did not affect levels of belief amongst children who were visited. And children who believed in a greater number of fantastical beings also tended to have higher levels of belief about the Candy Witch. And then researchers found that children's preference for toys or candy was not significantly related to their belief in the Candy Witch for the total sample, but older children were slightly more affected by their preference than younger children. And younger children with a low fantasy orientation attributed more human-like qualities to the Candy Witch than other children. And additionally, psychological properties, biological properties, and social properties were all attributed to the Candy Witch more often than human physical properties. And finally, the parent questionnaire revealed that there was no relation between parental encouragement and children's belief in the Candy Witch, and parents' mean estimates of their children's beliefs in the Candy Witch was 2.7 on a scale of 0 to 4. So researchers did a follow-up 1 year later, and 22 of the originally studied children were interviewed in early of the next October. And children were presented with a photograph of the Candy Witch and asked 6 memory questions about her. And they were also given the same reality status question, except they used a generic teacher this time instead of the children's actual preschool teacher. And they also completed a certainty rating task, a property attribution task, and the fantasy orientation task. And for the follow-up, the results were that older children who had not been visited by the Candy Witch remembered less than older children who were visited, and younger children's scores did not differ between those who were and weren't visited. And children with a low fantasy orientation remembered significantly more about the Candy Witch than those with high fantasy orientation. And 11 children did not change their beliefs. 5 switched to believing the Candy Witch was real, and 6 switched to saying that she was pretend or that they weren't sure. And finally, the number of other fantastical beings that the child believed in was the most significant factor related to their belief in that the Candy Witch was real. So for the interpretations, the findings from this study, specifically that not all children believed the Candy Witch was real, supported the idea that children do not always yield to adult suggestion. Contrary to the assumption that children grow inherently more rational with age, older children had higher levels of belief in the Candy Witch than younger children. And the author suggests that this might be caused by a higher cognitive maturity being required to believe in a being that there isn't as much physical evidence. And also older children may have a better ability to make connections between evidence, such as the phone call and the toy switch, to the existence of the Candy Witch. It's also important that they note that it's difficult to make a definitive claim based on the finding that children who were visited had stronger beliefs than those who were not, because children could not be randomly assigned to one condition or the other. It was up to whether the parents were okay.
Candy Witch. And high fantasy orientation was associated with stronger beliefs. However, the finding that fantasy orientation was not related to the children's beliefs limits the conclusions of these specific results. The toy and candy preference also had a significant effect on the beliefs of older children and poses the question, is belief a choice, or are children's preferences and goals influenced by what they attend to and the potential level of engagement with the fantasy entities, including the Candy Witch? Lastly, age and fantasy orientation influenced human and non-human property beliefs about the Candy Witch, with the younger participants being least likely to attribute non-human properties. And this was theorized to be due to being more dissimilar to humans in physical properties, yet they're different enough to attract attention and similar enough to be real.